prior to the arrival of white settlers in the early 1800s, this region was home to the Osage and Indian tribes. Several of the very first white men to stay in the area for a time were Thomas Wagnon and brothers James and Isaac Mars. They stayed in the West Washington County area during 1817 and 1818 in order to map the land, to hunt, and to look for potential farmland. Apparently, James Mars brought his wife and 5-year-old daughter Rachel with him because Rachel Mars died in 1818 and is the oldest documented burial in the Prairie Grove Cemetery. She's buried east of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church and in the historic section of the cemetery, and that was placed on the National Register in January of 2016. So Wagnon and the Mars brothers went back home to Tennessee, but Isaac Mars and Thomas Wagnon returned in 1827 with their families and slaves, and they settled in the Ray community north of Lincoln. Thomas Wagnon also claimed additional land around the spring in what is now Mock Park. In 1829, Andrew Buchanan, who had recently become an ordained minister with the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, left Kentucky with his wife Sinai and stepson James Preston Neal to visit his brothers in Cane Hill. During his visit, he heard about this nice piece of land with a spring several miles to the northeast, which was Thomas Wagnon's claimed land. He made an agreement with Wagnon to trade the land for 2 good sermons, and so he got that land and built a house on it. In 1831, Buchanan organized the Prairie congregation of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and later on a school for young children was started. The congregation bought, for $25, about 2.5 acres from the Buchanans in 1838 with a promise to build a church, a school, and use part of the land as a cemetery. At some point, a log building was constructed that served as the church and the school. The first post office in Prairie Grove was opened in 1840 and was called Sweet Home, and it closed 6 years later. Archibald Borden opened the second post office in 1857, which was named after his daughter Ada. The building was hit by bullets during the Battle of Prairie Grove and never reopened. Years later, the door, which had bullet holes in it, was stored in a garage after the post office was torn down, and the door was destroyed in a fire back in the 50s, I believe. The Battle of Prairie Grove started on December 7, 1862, and the Confederates used the Cumberland Church as a hospital during the battle. After the Confederates retreated south to Van Buren, the building was used to house the Union Army soldiers for several months. And when they left, it's believed that they set fire to the building and destroyed it. Around 1874, the town's second school opened in the newly constructed Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And this was a wood frame building that was located behind the current Presbyterian Church, and it faced east. In 1883, the Prairie Grove Institute, or the Methodist Academy, opened on the northeast corner of Bush and Neal Streets. It was the town's first school to teach children and teenagers. In 1901, it joined the new public school district. Also in 1883, the Ozark Mercantile, later renamed the Southern Mercantile, was built, and it's currently the oldest building on Main Street. The first brick building was constructed 3 years later across the street on the east side of the Southern, and it's still there also. In 1937, the owners tore down the second floor. In 1888, the third and current Cumberland Presbyterian Church opened, and the old church and school directly behind it was sold and dismantled. I'll mention James P. Neal. He was Andrew Buchanan's stepson, and he was an important part in Prairie Grove history. He eventually left Prairie Grove and became a lawyer in Fayetteville. He was a soldier in the Mexican-American War from 1847 to 1848, and he came back to Fayetteville and was elected mayor from 1851 to 1854. Neal returned to Prairie Grove in 1868 and settled on part of the old Buchanan property near the spring where he grew up. In 1871, he decided to formally establish Prairie Grove as an actual town and was soon appointed postmaster. A blacksmith and wagon shop opened in 1872. 3 years later, a storehouse was built, and in 1876, a steam-powered flour mill began operation. Main Street lots went on sale in March of 1877, and in September of that year, Neal requested a survey and plat for the downtown area. In 1888, physicians E.G. McCormick and W.W. Mahan got fed up with the rowdy behavior and what they described as drunkenness on the city streets, and they wrote a letter of incorporation and petition on a piece of notebook paper and sent it to the county judge, and the state approved its incorporation in July of 1888. In 1901, the first bank, called the Bank of Prairie Grove, opened. Also in 1901, a section of the Frisco Railroad line, the Ozark and Cherokee Central Railroad, began running, and the train depot was located several blocks south of Main Street. Around 1904, the Prairie Grove Canning and Evaporating Factory opened, processing locally grown fruits and vegetables, especially tomatoes. It's later renamed the Prairie Grove Canning Factory, and hundreds of local people, including families and their children, were employed at the business until it closed in 1978. In 1905, the Prairie Grove Public School graduated its first class with a grand total of 5 students. A year later, the downtown businesses on the north side of Buchanan Street were destroyed by fire. They didn't have access to water, so dynamite was used to slow the flames, and that shattered windows of the businesses across the street. In 1908, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, also known as the UDC, purchased 9 acres of land where the Battle of Prairie Grove was fought so they could create a park for Confederate veteran reunions. In 1911, a new 3-story public school building opened on the site of the old Prairie Grove Institute. And in 1931, another school building was added for elementary students across the street on the south side of the existing school. The Prairie Grove Public Library opened in the American Legion Hut in 1935. The librarian's salary was paid for by the New Deal's Work Progress Administration Program, or WPA. In 1942, the railroad line and depot closed, and in 1951, the first school buildings on the current campus were completed. The first clothesline fair was held at the Prairie Grove Battlefield Park in 1957, and vendors hung their artwork on clotheslines. The Art Center of the Ozarks and the Prairie Grove Lions Club sponsor this annual event. In 1963, Dr. Will Mock donated to the city the land where the spring is, which he had bought in 1901, and it officially became Mock Park.
What are some things that come to mind with you about Prairie Grove that have happened in more recent history, maybe since that last history book was done, that noteworthy things?
The town's gotten a lot bigger, and we used to be bigger than Farmington. Farmington's bigger than we are, and that's due to the growth of the whole area.